She was 22 years old, and everything she owned fit inside a canvas pack the size of a flour sack. A spare dress, a wool scarf, a paring knife, and a bookbinder's awl wrapped in a square of soft leather that still smelled faintly of her teacher's hands. She had $4.30 pressed flat in the toe of her left boot, and no plan that reached past the next 24 hours. And with that $4.30, she bought an abandoned grist mill on the edge of the Miramichi River that had not turned its wheel in 14 years. But what nobody in the village knew, what she herself would not understand, until she climbed through the trapdoor above the millstone floor, on her third morning there, was that someone had left something behind in that mill, and what was written in the pages tucked beneath the grinding stone would rewrite the story she had been told about herself her entire life. If you found your way here to Cottage Stories, we're glad you did. Stay with us, because this one is worth hearing all the way through. Her name was Norah Keating, and she was born in the winter of 1887 in a two-room house on the outskirts of Bathurst, New Brunswick. The only child of a woman named Cecelia Keating, who had been a bookbinder before illness took the steadiness from her hands, and a father she had never once met. Cecelia did not speak bitterly of the man. She did not speak of him at all. And Norah, who had her mother's gray eyes and her mother's habit of going quiet when something troubled her, learned early not to ask. What Cecelia could give her daughter, she gave with both hands. She taught Norah to read before the child could tie her own boots. She taught her that a book was not just paper and thread, but a small house you could carry in your pocket, and that the person who bound it was the one who made it capable of surviving. She showed Norah how to cut and fold a signature, how to press a spine true, how to wet leather, just enough that it would take the shape of the boards beneath it without cracking. She showed her how to punch holes through layers of folded paper with an awl so precisely that the thread would pull through cleanly from one side to the other, and the book would lie flat when you opened it, and stay flat the way a book should. Cecelia called the awl a bookbinder's most honest tool because it made its mark exactly where you placed it. No more, no less. She died in the spring of 1906, quietly, in the narrow bed she had shared with Norah through every cold winter since Norah was born, with the window open and the sound of mud geese moving north over the river, which was a sound she loved. She left Norah the awl, wrapped in its leather square, and a copy of a field guide to Atlantic birds with a pressed mayflower tucked inside the front cover. And her blessing, which Cecelia had always said was worth more than money because money could be spent, and a blessing could not. The woman who shaped Norah next, who shaped her perhaps more deeply than she could have known at the time, was a bookbinder named Simone Jourdain, who ran a small bindery out of the back of her house on King Street in Chatham, and who had been, in earlier decades, a printer's apprentice, a paper marbler, a gilder of book spines, and for a brief, improbable period in her 50s, a mapmaker's assistant who had learned to engrave copper plates with a burins, so fine it could trace a river's path in a line no thicker than a hair. Simone Jourdain was 64 when Norah arrived on her doorstep at 19, carrying two of Cecilia's finished books and a note written in Cecilia's careful hand, asking Simone if she might take the girl on. They had been friends once, Cecelia and Simone, before the years and the distance and the quiet separations that illness makes inevitable had grown between them. Simone read the note at the doorstep, folded it into her apron pocket and looked at Norah for a long moment. Then she said, "Come in and show me how your mother taught you to sew a spine." Norah came in. She stayed for 3 years. Simone Jourdain taught her everything her mother had not yet reached. She taught her to gild with gold leaf, so thin it breathed in the air of the room, and how to press a heated brass tool into leather to make a design that would outlast the hand that made it. She taught her the chemistry of paste, how the right ratio of flour to water to alum could make a substance that would hold 2 pieces of paper together for a century without yellowing or curling. She taught her to marble paper by floating pigments on a surface of size, drawing combs through the colors and patterns with names like peacock and Spanish wave and nonpareil, and then laying a sheet of paper down on the surface and lifting it up transformed. She taught her that beauty was not decoration, that beauty in a craft was the visible proof of the maker's understanding of their material, and that a well-made book, one that would open flat and close true and sit square on a shelf for 100 years, was as much an act of love as anything that could be named. Simone never married. She had made that decision at 27, after a year of watching what marriage did to the women around her, and she had not revisited it. She told Norah once, pressing a length of bookcloth smooth across a board, that the most dangerous thing a woman could mistake for love was the relief of being chosen. That being chosen was not the same thing as being seen, and that a woman who confused the two would spend the rest of her life making herself smaller to fit the frame someone else had built for her. Norah did not fully understand what she meant at the time. She came to understand it very clearly later. Simone Jourdain died in the autumn of 1909, of a stroke that came without warning on a Tuesday morning, while she was sizing a stack of end papers. She had been fine at breakfast. By noon she was gone. She left Norah her tools, the bone folders and the knocking hammer, and the gilding cushion and the small engraving burin, and the awl that Norah already carried, and she left her a letter in a sealed envelope, marked with Norah's name in Simone's precise, compressed handwriting. The letter said only this: "You know more than you believe you know. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. Go somewhere that needs what you have. S.J." Norah was 22. She had her mother's awl in her pack, and Simone's instruction in her hands, and 2 lines of a letter in her chest that she pressed against like a compass. She did not have a home. The reason for that requires going back 6 months. A man named Gerald Scoville had arrived in Chatham in the spring of 1909. He was 41, a lumber broker, with business connections in Fredericton and Halifax. A man who wore good wool and spoke in the measured tones of someone accustomed to being agreed with. He came to the bindery on a Tuesday in May to have a set of ledgers rebound, and he stayed for an hour longer than necessary. And he came back the following week with more ledgers. And the week after that with a question that had nothing to do with bookbinding at all. Gerald Scoville was not cruel in the way that leaves obvious marks. He was the other kind. The kind that makes you feel, gradually and with great patience, that his preferences are simply the correct way to see things, and that your own preferences are a charming but impractical form of stubbornness. He told Norah that her work was impressive for a woman, which she understood was meant as a compliment. He told her that a bindery was fine for now, but that she would eventually want something more settled. He told her that her mother had been a woman of certain limitations, and that it was no criticism of the dead to say so. She should have paid attention to the thing that moved in her chest when he said that about her mother. She didn't. Or she did, and she convinced herself it was just her own defensiveness, which is perhaps the same thing. She married him in August of 1909. She understood her mistake by November. She was not dramatic about it, even in her own mind. She did not tell herself she had been deceived, though she had been. She told herself she had not been paying the right kind of attention. Gerald Scoville was a man who needed to be the only light in a room, and, when Norah worked at her bench, in the evenings, which she continued to do, because Simone had left her the tools and the space and she could not simply stop. Gerald grew quiet in a way that was louder than any argument, and when she brought home payment for a set of journals she had bound for a law firm in Chatham, he looked at the money for a long moment before saying, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that she would not need to do that much longer. And when Simone died and left Norah the tools and the letter, and a small sum of money that Norah had not known existed, enough to last perhaps a year if spent carefully, Gerald told her, very reasonably, very quietly, that the money should go toward the house, that it made more sense that way, that Simone would have wanted her to be secure. Norah did not give him the money. That was when the quiet in Gerald Scoville's house became something else. We will not go into the particulars of what followed. Norah knew what she needed to know by February of 1910. She packed her canvas bag on a Tuesday morning while Gerald was at his office, and she wrapped Simone Jourdain's tools in a length of linen and nested them carefully between her spare dress and her wool scarf. She took the money Simone had left her. Not all of it, because she felt, with a complicated mix of guilt and practicality that would take years to untangle, that she should leave some. She took $4.30. She tucked it in her boot. She left the house key on the kitchen table, and she walked out without locking the door behind her. And she did not look back, and she was not dramatic about that either. She walked east along the river. She walked for 2 days. The first night she slept in the back room of a church in a village called Norden, whose minister's wife brought her tea and a blanket and did not ask her a single question, which was one of the finest gifts anyone had ever given her. The second night she slept on a bench in the waiting room of a small rail station, with her bag pressed against her ribs and her boots still on, and the sound of the river moving in the dark outside the window. She crossed into the Miramichi Valley on the second day in the late afternoon. When the light came through the spruce trees, at an angle that turned the river the color of old copper, and she stood on the bank for a long moment and breathed air that smelled of river mud and cold pine, and the faint sweetness of last year's meadowgrass still pressed flat under the snow that had not entirely melted from the north-facing slopes. The village of Dunmore Crossing was smaller even than she expected. A single main road, a general store, a post office that shared a building with a barber shop, a Catholic church with a gray stone facade and a wooden steeple that leaned approximately 3 degrees to the west. A handful of houses set back from the road. A sawmill operating with low winter hours. The store was run by a man named Percy Sauve, who was 67 years old and had the patience that comes from having lived long enough to see most problems solve themselves if you give them enough time. Norah bought a pound of oats and a quarter-pound of dried beans, and a box of matches and a small tin of lard with 60 cents of her money, and asked whether there was any work in the valley for someone who could bind and repair books, and whether there was anywhere to stay that might be had for little or nothing. Percy Sauve looked at her for a moment. At her hands, at her bag, at her eyes which were steady, he said, "There's the old Fenwick mill." He explained it, the way men explain things they consider settled fact. The Fenwick grist mill had sat empty on the river, bend a mile and a half north of the village since 1896, when the last owner had died without heirs, and the county had taken possession and found no buyers because the wheel mechanism was seized and the upper floor was considered unsafe. The county had been trying to be rid of it for years. 2 weeks ago, they had dropped the price to $5, which was not a price for a mill, but a price for the paperwork to stop. Norah said, "Will you write up the transfer?" Percy Sauve blinked. Then he reached under the counter for his record book. She pressed $4.30 onto the scarred wood of that counter. The same $4.30 she had taken from Simone Jourdain's legacy. Money that Gerald Scoville had considered as good as his. And the Fenwick mill, with its frozen wheel and its questionable floor, became hers. "We want to stop here for a moment because this is where most people would have felt the weight of what she'd done. No money left. A mill nobody wanted. February in New Brunswick, which is a specific kind of cold that gets into stone and stays there." And Norah Keating stood at the counter of Percy Sauve's general store, holding a handwritten county transfer document with her name on it, and she told us, or she would have told us, if we'd been there, that what she felt was not fear. What she felt was the sensation of a door opening inward instead of closing outward, which is a very different kind of feeling than it first appears to be. The Fenwick mill was not a ruin in the way that collapsed things are ruins. It was a ruin in the way that untended things are. Solid in its bones, damaged in its surfaces, exhausted in the way that buildings become exhausted when no one breathes in them. The stone foundation was a full 2 feet thick at the base, local granite laid in even courses, mortared in lime that had set over the decades into something harder than the stone itself in places. The walls were timber frame construction, the heavy posts and beams hand-hewn from white pine, still true. The roof was intact on the south side, sagging dangerously on the north, where 2 of the purlin beams had rotted through, and a section of cedar shake no larger than a kitchen table had given way, and let in 14 years of weather. The damage was local, not general. The rot had not reached the main frame. The wheel was seized, as Percy Sauve had said, but not beyond repair. The iron axle had rusted in its housing on the south bearing, and someone had removed the wooden paddles from the lower third of the wheel, perhaps to use the lumber for something else. But the wheel itself, the great circle of mortised and pegged hardwood, was structurally intact. She could see that even in February light. The ground floor housed the millstone mechanism. 2 circular stones, the runner above and the bedstone below, connected by a wooden shaft to the wheel outside. The runner stone had not moved in 14 years, but when Norah put both hands on it and pushed, it shifted. Just barely. Not seized, only still. The first floor above was the one considered unsafe. The previous owner, according to Percy Sauve, had used it for storage. And when a beam had cracked sometime in the 1890s, it had been declared off-limits and had stayed that way. The staircase was a steep, narrow thing built against the south wall, more ladder than stairs. 3 of the treads were missing. The remaining ones held her weight. The upper floor was dim, lit only by 2 small windows facing the river, but it was not the disaster she had been told it was. The cracked beam was a secondary member, not a primary one. She could see from the framing that the main structure had not shifted. The floor itself, wide planks of old-growth pine, was sound everywhere except directly beneath the damaged beam, where a section perhaps 4 feet square had softened and would need to be replaced. The rest of the floor held firm underfoot with no give at all. It was on her 3rd morning, working her way across that upper floor, with a lantern in one hand, and her probing the boards with the handle of her bone folder, the way Simone had taught her to test paper for internal damage. Press, listen, move, that she found the trapdoor. It was set into the floor near the north window, a square about 18 inches across, fitted so cleanly into the surrounding boards that she had walked over it twice without noticing. A small iron ring, painted over, and then the paint chipped away again, sat flush in a recess. She knelt and worked her awl under the edge of the ring and levered it up and pulled. The trapdoor swung on leather hinges that were stiff but intact. Beneath it was not the mill's subfloor, which is what she expected. Instead, there was a cavity, a deliberate one, framed on all four sides with fitted lumber, about the size of a large hat box and about 14 inches deep, lined with oilcloth pressed smooth and dry around the edges, and inside the oilcloth, wrapped in a second layer of heavy canvas and tied with a length of twine that had turned the color of old straw, was something that had weight to it, not heavy, dense. She carried it to the window, where the February light came through gray and clean off the river, and she set it on the sill and untied the twine with her fingers. Slowly, the way Simone had taught her to unwrap a book that had been damaged. Carefully, because you could not always tell from outside what you would find inside. Inside the canvas were two things. The first was a bundle of papers, folded in thirds and held together with a length of linen thread tied in a bow, of all things. A bow, not a knot, as though the person who tied it had wanted whoever found it to be able to open it easily, without a knife, without effort. 14 sheets of paper, dense with handwriting and faded brown ink stitched down the left margin, through two holes punched with what she recognized because she had used one every day of her working life. As a bookbinder's awl. Someone had bound these pages. Someone who knew how. The second was a tin box, small, the kind that might once have held tobacco or hard candy, sealed around the lid with a bead of wax that had been worked into the joint with a fingertip. When she pried it open with her own awl, the wax broke cleanly. Inside, pressed in a nest of fine cedar shavings, was a bookbinder's gilding tool, a small brass wheel on a wooden handle, its face engraved with a pattern of interlocking leaves, blackened with age but intact. The wheel still turned on its axle, smooth and precise, the way fine tools turn when they have been made with care and used with care and put away clean. She held it in her palm for a long time. Then she unfolded the papers. The handwriting was small and precise and slanted to the left, the hand of someone trained in an older style, French inflected, with particular loops on the ascending letters that she associated with the convent schools of the previous century. And she read it there at the window, with the river moving below her, and the cold coming through the glass in the way that February cold does. Not in a rush, but steadily, like something that intends to stay. The pages read, "My name is Vivienne Sainte-Marie Fenwick, and I am writing this in the winter of 1894. In the mill, my husband Robert and I built together in the year 1871. Robert died in October of last year, and our two sons, our eldest Henri and our youngest Bertrand, have gone west, Henri to Manitoba and Bertrand to the coast of British Columbia, both of them following the kind of horizon that only young men see clearly enough to chase. I am 60 years old. I am alone in this mill, which was built for a family and which has become very quiet, and I do not know how much longer I will stay. I was a bookbinder before I came to this valley. I trained for 4 years under a woman in Quebec City whose name was Cecelia, who was the finest craftsperson I have ever known, and who told me when I left her shop that I carried the work in my hands, and that no one could take what was in my hands away from me. I believed her then. I believe her still. When Robert and I came to this valley, there was no one who needed a bookbinder. There was a mill that needed turning, and so I turned the mill, and I kept the books, and I bound what came to me. The church registers, the school primers, the farmer's account ledgers, the occasional volume that arrived damaged in the mail and that someone wanted saved. It was not what I had trained for, but it was what the place needed, and I had learned from Cecelia that a craftswoman goes where she is needed and makes the need her own. I am leaving behind the gilding wheel that Cecelia gave me when I completed my training. She had been given it by her own teacher, and she told me it was the kind of tool that should always be in working hands. That a gilding wheel sitting idle was a small sadness in the world. I could not take it with me where I am going. I am moving to my sister's house in Campbellton, where there is no room for the life I carried here, and I could not bear to sell it to someone who would not know what it was. To whoever finds this, I do not know who you are. I do not know what brought you to this mill, or what you found when you came through the door. But if you are here, you have chosen to look at this place and see what it might be, rather than what it has become. That is the only quality that matters. That is the quality that Robert and I had when we first walked the banks of this river in the summer of 1870, with nothing but the clothes we were wearing and the intention to build something that would last. The mill is sound, though it does not look it. The stone foundation will outlast us both. The wheel needs its bearings freed and its lower paddles replaced, but the wheel itself is old-growth hardwood that will not rot in your lifetime. The upper floor needs 1 beam sistered and 4 boards replaced near the north window, and then it is solid. The millstone mechanism needs only cleaning and oil. I know, because I ran it for 20 years. There is no money in this box. I took my savings to Campbellton, because I needed them and because I earned them and because they were mine to take. What I am leaving is the gilding wheel and these pages, which are the closest I could come to handing you my hands. Use the mill. That is all I ask. Turn the wheel. Let the stones run. Make this place work again, whatever work it turns out to do. Robert and I were happy here. The river was good to us. The valley people were good to us. They will be good to you too, if you let them. Bind something, even if only for yourself. Vivienne Sainte Marie Fenwick, written in her own hand by the north window of the Fenwick Mill on the 12th of January, 1894, with the river frozen below and the chickadees at the sill, which means the cold is breaking, which Robert always said was a good sign. Norah read the letter once through, and then set it down on the windowsill and stood very still with her hands in her lap. And the river moved below her the way rivers move in February, dark and slow under a skin of shelf ice along the banks, and a pair of mergansers cut upstream close to the far shore, and the mill was quiet around her, in the way that buildings are quiet when they are used to waiting and have gotten good at it. She did not cry immediately. She read the letter again, and on the second reading, she began to cry. Not the way she had expected to cry. Not with the grief that had been sitting in her sternum since August, since November, since February, since all the small successive losses that had led her to this window, in this mill, in this valley. She cried with something she did not have an immediate word for. And, later, she decided the word was recognition. The sensation of reading a page and understanding that the person who wrote it knew something you had needed someone to know, and had put it down in words that would reach you even across 16 years. Someone had been here before her. Someone who knew what it was to carry a trade in her hands and arrive somewhere that had not expected her, and make the place hers anyway. Someone who had left, not because she failed, but because her time there was complete, and who had wanted to pass something forward to whoever came next. She did not spend the winter in despair. She spent it working. The first thing she did, the very next morning, was go back to Percy Sauve's store and tell him what she had found in the mill. Not the letter, that was hers, and she kept it, but the condition of the mill, the specifics of what needed doing, and what she thought it could become. Percy Sauve listened, with his hands folded on the counter, the same posture he had used when she bought her oats. And then he said there was a man named Aldrich Comeau, who lived up the road, and who had been a millwright before his knees went, and who might come and look at the wheel if she asked him right. She asked him right. Aldrich Comeau was 61, with a white beard and the kind of knees that made stairs a negotiation, and hands that still knew exactly what they were doing, regardless of the rest of him. He came to the mill on a Thursday, walked around the outside 3 times before coming in, put his hands on the wheel mechanism for a long moment with his eyes closed, and then said, "The iron axle's the trouble. South bearings seized solid. I can get it free, but it'll take time and heat." She said, "How much time?" he said. 2 weeks if the forge cooperates. "I'll need a helper," she said. "I'll be the helper." He looked at her, the way Percy Sauve had looked at her, then he nodded. They worked 2 weeks on the wheel. Aldrich Comeau showed her how to build a fire against the bearing housing, not to damage the metal, but to expand it just enough to break the bond the rust had made. He showed her how to drive the axle free with a drift pin and a maul, one precise blow at a time, reading the movement of the metal the way you read the movement of paper under a bone folder, for resistance, for release, for the moment when force becomes ease, and you know the thing has given way. He showed her how to reseat the bearing and pack it with tallow, and how to cut new paddles for the lower wheel from green ash that would season in place once it was hung, and how to pin them into their mortises so they would hold against the full pressure of the current. On the day, they sent the wheel moving for the first time. A Thursday in March, when the river was running fast with snowmelt, and the sound of it filled the valley. Norah stood on the bank and watched the great circle begin to turn, slowly at first, each paddle lifting and falling through the current, with a sound like a collective exhale, and felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled since August. Since before August, if she was honest. Since perhaps longer than that. On the fourth day of the millwork, a woman named Ruth Arsenault arrived at the door with a pot of pea soup and a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, wrapped in a cloth. Ruth was 55, the wife of a potato farmer, with a face built for directness and a voice that carried without being raised. She set the soup on the sill of the ground floor and said, "Aldrich told me there was a woman up here working the old Fenwick place. I thought you might need feeding." She came back 3 days later with a jar of apple butter and a pair of wool socks. And the day after that, she brought her husband Etienne, who looked at the crack in the upper floor beam, walked the perimeter of the north wall, and said, "I can sister that beam with a piece of timber from my barn loft. It's been sitting there since before the war. Won't cost you anything but a meal." He sistered the beam on a Saturday. He brought his son to help lift, and when it was done, the upper floor was solid. A woman named Constance Hebert, who was 48 and kept a school on the far side of the village, appeared one afternoon with 6 primers that had lost their bindings, and asked, with a combination of hope and practicality, that Norah recognized as the specific outlook of someone who could not afford to be sentimental about need, whether there was any chance the new millwoman knew anything about book repair. Norah looked at the primers. She looked at her tools. She said yes. She repaired the primers at the window bench she had built on the second floor, using lumber from Etienne Arsenault's barn loft, cut to length and nailed to the south wall below the good window. She worked with her bone folder and her awl and the fine linen thread that had tied Vivienne Sainte Marie Fenwick's pages together, which she had kept because it was good thread and because it seemed right to use it for the purpose it had been made for. She sewed new signatures, glued new end papers, cut new boards from a scrap of basswood she found in the corner of the ground floor, and covered them with a piece of bookcloth she had brought in her pack all the way from Chatham, which was the last piece she owned. When Constance Hebert came to collect the primers, she stood at the workbench for a long moment and ran her thumb along the spine of the first one, the way you test a thing to see whether it is what it appears to be. Then she said, "I'll tell the church. They have registers going back to 1843 that are in pieces." The church registers came the following week. Norah worked on them for 10 days. The priest, a man named Father Doucet, who was 67 and cautious about things he did not yet understand, came to check on the progress twice and said nothing on the first visit, and on the second visit said only, "My handwriting is better than this," which Norah took to mean that he was satisfied. A man named Gaston Thibodeau, who operated the sawmill 2 miles south, appeared one morning with a sack of cedar shingles for the roof section that had given way on the north side, and said he'd heard she was fixing the Fenwick place and that it was about time someone did. He helped her carry the shingles up and showed her the pattern of laying that would shed ice melt rather than hold it. Then he mentioned that his daughter was getting married in June and had wanted a guest book bound in green leather, and he had not found anyone who could do it. Norah could do it. Each person who came brought something specific and left without ceremony, the way people do in small places where help is understood to be practical rather than performative, and where the keeping of accounts would be too complicated to bother with. Norah began to understand the texture of this, the particular weave of reciprocity that held a community like Dunmore Crossing together, not through organized gestures or formal structures, but through the steady accumulation of small acts: a pot of soup, a beam, a sack of shingles, a set of damaged books, an introduction to the next person who needed what she had. She set up her bindery on the second floor, at the window bench facing the river. She built a small press from 2 pieces of hardwood and a pair of threaded bolts, the way Simone Jourdain had taught her, and she weighted it with stones from the riverbank. She ordered bookcloth and leather and pasteboard through Percy Sauve's Catalogue Connection in Fredericton, and when the order arrived 6 weeks later, she felt the particular pleasure of unpacking materials you know how to use. The smell of the bookcloth, the weight of the pasteboard, the way leather folds when it has been properly dressed. She ground wheat for the valley farmers when they needed it. Aldrich Comeau had shown her how to dress the millstone, how to reset the gap between runner and bed to the thickness needed for coarse meal, how to feel through the vibration of the housing when the stones were running true. She charged a small toll in meal, the traditional arrangement, and kept what she did not need and ground more when she had it. She bound and repaired books, registers, journals, primers, hymnals, one extremely battered copy of a French-language almanac from 1881. that a farmer named Donat Godet had been using as a reference for planting dates and did not want to lose. She charged what the work was worth, fairly, and kept her accounts in a small ledger she had bound herself. Its cover green, because that was the first leather she had ordered. And she liked the color against the pine of her workbench. She used Vivienne Sainte Marie Fenwick's gilding wheel for the first time on a Tuesday in April, heating it in the flame of her small spirit lamp until the brass was just warm enough to sink into leather without scorching it, and rolling it along the cover of Gaston Thibodeau's daughter's wedding guestbook in a straight line that she had ruled with a divider. The pattern it left was a line of interlocking leaves, small and clean and precise, catching the light at the angle you had to move the book to see it properly, which is how gilding works. It does not announce itself. It waits to be noticed by someone looking carefully. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went back to work. By May, the wheel was running 3 days a week. By June, the bindery had more commissions than she could complete in a month. By July, she had repaid what she thought of as the community's investment in her. Not in money, which was not how such things were calculated, but in the particular way that communities calculate value, by being reliable, by doing good work, by being a person that the valley had started to consider, without ceremony or formal announcement, one of its own. She kept Vivienne Sainte Marie Fenwick's letter in the tin box on the windowsill, beside Simone Jourdain's gilding wheel, and her mother Cecilia's awl, and the field guide with the pressed mayflower in the front. These 4 things sat in a row on that sill above the river, and in the late afternoon when the light came through at a long angle and caught the brass of the gilding wheel and the gilt spine of the field guide, she would look at them sometimes and think about the particular arithmetic of inheritance. Not money, not name, not property in the ordinary sense. A way of seeing, a way of working, a way of arriving somewhere that did not know you and making it, slowly, through the accumulated weight of days and labor and small reciprocal acts, a place that did. She thought about Vivienne Sainte Marie Fenwick, who had bound pages together with an awl and linen thread and left them under a trapdoor in a mill for a stranger she would never meet, and who had understood, which is the remarkable thing, that what she was leaving was not charity but continuity. One pair of trained hands passing something forward to the next pair, across 16 years, across every boundary that time and loss can make. She thought about Simone Jourdain, who had told her that beauty was not decoration but proof of understanding, and who had pressed into her hands not just tools but a way of seeing the world that had served her in every situation the world had placed her in, including, and especially the ones it had not prepared her for. She thought about her mother Cecelia, who had been a bookbinder with trembling hands, who had given her daughter every skill she had before the skills left her, and who had sent her forward with a letter to a woman in Chatham and a pressed mayflower in a field guide, and a blessing, she said, could not be spent. She thought about Gerald Scoville, briefly, and then she thought about the river instead. The river was a better use of the space. On an evening in late August, when the light lasted long, and came through the south window of the second floor at a low angle that turned the river, the color of birch bark, Norah Keating sat at her workbench with a half-bound journal in her hands and the sounds of the valley coming through the open window. The wheel turning below, the water moving over the stones, the barn swallows making their last circuits of the evening before the light went, and she felt, with a completeness she had not felt since she was very small, sitting beside her mother's work table, while Cecilia's steady hands pulled thread through paper, the particular sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not where she had planned to be, not where anyone had told her she belonged, not where the world had placed her, or the world had permitted her, or the world had chosen for her, where she had walked to, and stayed, and made hers. The awl in her hand, the thread running true, the wheel turning below, and the river doing what rivers do, which is move in the direction that the land is asking it to move, and go where it goes, and make something useful of the going. We think about Norah sometimes here at Cottage Stories, when we hear about a person who found a place by not looking for it, who built something by simply beginning to build, who was given an inheritance made entirely of other people's knowledge and passed it on in the only way worth passing anything on, by using it until it became your own and then leaving the door open. There is a mill somewhere that a woman repaired with other people's help and her own 2 hands. There is a wheel that turns above a river that does not know what year it is. There is a gilding wheel on a windowsill that still makes its mark exactly where you place it. And we want to ask you this, not as a riddle and not as a challenge, but as a genuine question that we find ourselves coming back to. What is the thing that someone gave you, not as an object, not as money, but as a way of seeing or working or being in the world, that you are still using without knowing it? What inheritance are you already carrying that you have not yet thought to name?